Hello watch lovers, friends old and new from all over the world, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have a Bovet watch on the bench. Bovet is a very interesting brand and they have a very strange history, but we'll get back to that a little bit. Let's first have a look at this watch, see if it works. It wasn't running, but it actually did start running after a little while. But we see the chronograph does not work. Another thing to see is that the dial is in not great condition, but it is in good enough, in my view, not to refinish. We will discuss that a little bit more. And we see the chrome plated case is in really bad condition. So we're going to have to do a number on the case. One interesting little tidbit, if we look at the case back, whenever the case back says stainless steel back, you know the rest of the watch is not stainless steel. Yeah, if you hear that when you shake a watch, it's not good. The movement is totally loose. We're going to see why that is as well. Let's first get the case back open. We use this sticky ball for that. And inside the case we find the Landron 51 movement. See, it is running okay now, and that's good to see. But the chronograph is not very interested in starting. There's quite a lot of old grime, but the watch is also completely dry. So yeah, it's been a while since this one has been serviced for sure. And we see that if we engage the chronograph, then the watch stops. So something is not well in the chronograph mechanism either. Hopefully just a service needed. Yeah, and that hair doesn't help either. These two holes here is where the case screws should have been. I'm not sure where they went. But someone just put the movement back in the case without them, and yeah, I don't know. We're using this little sheet of plastic. I just cut it out from one of those tiny bags to protect the dial. And then we're using these hand levers to pry the hands off the different tubes. These hands were very stuck. And these old movements have dog screws, and they are accessed from the train side of the movement, not from the side of the movement. They can be a little bit tricky to position in the right place, but ultimately we get the dial off. Given that this movement does not have an hour counter, the dial side is pretty simple. Just the keyless works. Let's first take the balance out. It's a little bit tricky to access the click in this movement, so we're going to start taking off the chronograph parts before we let the mainspring down. The balance itself looks fine, so no problem there. And ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the pingiest spring ever. Oops. And yes, putting that spring back is even trickier. As far as chronographs go, this is a very simple one. We talked a little bit about the Landron chronograph movements in previous videos. This is the 51, but it's closely related to the 48 that we, for instance, did in the Helios chronograph video. And as in the 48, the 51 chronograph is also started with a top pusher. But then it's not paused with the top pusher as most chronographs are, but rather with the bottom pusher. So the bottom pusher does both the pause and the reset. We'll let down the mainspring so we can then take off the pallet fork, and then we can inspect the end shakes and the side shakes a little bit more, see if the train runs freely, which it seems to do. So probably just a lot of dirt in the various pivots. So a rather common question for old watches is how do they get dirty? I mean, it's not like they're exposed to the open air and all those things, right? Well, the thing is that watches breathe just a little bit. So with different air pressure, with different temperatures, you're going to have a slight in and out movement of air. And that air, of course, does contain small particles of different types of stuff. And basically the older watches, the less tight it is for resistance to dust, resistant to water, etc. And hence you get dirt. And the danger is when that dirt mixes with oil in the pivot holes, because then you get more of a sort of abrasive paste, which is obviously not good for the pivots. We're using this special tool to take the chronograph driving wheel off. You might have noticed that the driving wheel actually wobbled ever so slightly. And that is a bit of a design flaw with this movement. We'll look a little bit at that later. But there are a few screws that are intended to help hold the chronograph parts down. And if you unscrew those screws, you will put pressure on the driving wheel. So that's most likely what has happened. We'll see that the 3/4 plate is kind of stuck, doesn't want to come out, and there's nothing to really hold it anymore. So it turns out it's the third wheel. But the pivot was pretty much stuck inside the hole. And the reason is dirt. A little bit difficult to see here, but if we zoom in, maybe we can see it better. And it might not look so bad, but remember that there's very little power actually in the watch. So it doesn't take much to stop the whole train. So I mentioned initially that I think Bovet is actually a very interesting brand, and that's a lot due to the history of the brand. Nowadays it's called Bovet Fleurier, and they also sell watches with a Bovet 1822 moniker. And I think even Dr. Watson would be able to say that 1822 probably relates to the foundation of the company. It started in London by Edouard Bovet. And he made a fortune selling watches in China. Back then it was, of course, pocket watches. And one of the things that really set Bovet apart was that they heavily adorned the movements. And they also more or less invented the display case back, showing those movements. And when I say heavily adorned, I do not mean the odd blued screw, I mean heavily adorned. And if you see these pictures now, it's really quite outstanding craftsmanship. Bovet was so dominant in large parts of the country that they even were sort of accepted as kind of a currency, the watches. They were referred to as Bovet in China. It was sort of a split market between Vacheron and Bovet. And this lasted for a few decades. But then in the middle of the 19th century, things started going a little bit downhill in China, both in the country itself, but also for the watches. So as a result, Bovet pulled out of China, and after that followed a little bit of mixed takeovers and so forth. And the watch we have here is from the 1940s, and it's actually from the period that Favre-Leuba owned Bovet. Interestingly, this exact model is the one that you can find on the Bovet Wikipedia page, if you choose to go there. And just to wrap up the history of Bovet while the watch cleaning machine does its job, Bovet is nowadays really a high-end manufacturer, kind of back to the same style they did back with the Chinese market. Heavily adorned watches, quite artistic, and a lot of one-offs. And obviously with a price that also corresponds to that. Now, getting back to this watch, we see that the mainspring we took out is not exactly new. That is a really old mainspring. So this watch has not been serviced in a very long time. I would probably say 40 years or something, at least. So we're putting on a new mainspring. We'll first line it up so it is in pretty much the right spot. And then we press it down as much as we can. And then the key is to make sure that the bridle end goes in first. Then the rest should follow. Might have to push it in a little bit with the end of your tweezers or something, but that's okay. So perhaps one thing you will have noticed or thought of when I'm talking about the different brands and history and so forth is that there's a lot of intertwined names and brands and what have you. That is of course due to Switzerland being a small country. A lot of small villages where you had a lot of watchmaking, both on a high level and more as making parts by farmers who did this as their winter jobs. But it is an interesting patchwork of ownerships and influences between the different brands. It goes back centuries. We have to take the balance off the cock in order to be able to oil the capstone. This is an old movement before you had shock settings. So they're typically screwed in from the underside. As I was inspecting the balance, I also saw it was quite dirty, the pivots on it, so I cleaned those a little bit as well. Now, speaking of winter, I was talking with a friend the other day and sort of complaining that there seemed to be so much more snow in the old days when we were young. And somehow we kind of concluded that English is a very poor language when it comes to snow. It's a very rich language for a lot of things, but when it comes to snow, it's kind of hard to describe snow in English. In Norwegian, there's quite a lot of different terms for different types of snow. And probably the most famous notion in that sense is that the Eskimos have like 100 different words for snow. And my friend said, yeah, well, duh. Back in the old days, what else would they have to talk about, right? I mean, seals and snow, that's pretty much it. Perhaps the odd polar bear. So imagine a conversation if you didn't have a lot of words for snow. It would be like, hey, did you see Sven the other day? You mean the day it snowed so much? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Doesn't really make for an intriguing conversation, right? But imagine if you have like 100 words for snow. It'd be like, hey, did you see Sven the other day? You mean the day it snowed so much? Yeah, that really light snow. Yeah, it's much better than that heavy snow we had 2 days ago. Yeah, and much better than that yellow snow. Anyway, we got the balance back in. Let's see if it oscillates freely. That looks just fine. So let's assemble the rest of the base movement. Remember that the click and the crown wheel is on the underside of this 3/4 bridge. Quite common in these old movements. It's not too much of a difference whether or not these things are on top of the bridge or underneath. The only thing is you have to be a little bit more careful when you put the bridge back in, so that the click engages properly with the ratchet wheel. Speaking of display case backs, I think nowadays watches should have a display case back pretty much as a standard, and it is of course very common. The main brand that never does it is Rolex, even though their movements would certainly be enjoyed if they were seen. And the reason I think that watches should have case backs as more or less a standard is because, as I discussed before, and my view is very clear, watches aren't utilitarian objects anymore meant to show time, because they don't show time as good as any other clock we see daily. But they are fascinating because of the way they work. It's quite astounding that even hundreds of years ago, skilled people were able to shape metal into timepieces that could show the time to an accuracy of 99.9%. 99.9% accuracy would mean that the watch is off about 1.5 minutes per day. And of course, nowadays you should expect 99.99% accuracy, which is almost 9 seconds off per day, and even less than that. So the actual accuracy is actually pretty mind-blowing. But it is, of course, only in the last couple of decades that we really started being more dependent, if you will, on seconds. Speaking of which, Bovet was actually one of the first that also introduced seconds hands to their watches. So that was another milestone reached by the Bovet brand. And yes, this crown is very, very worn. I do not know if it's original or not, but I do know that it's too worn to keep, so we are going to replace it. We're putting this special blue grease on the extended arbor of the center wheel, and then we can press the cannon pinion onto that arbor. When I say press it on, that really means that it's friction fit, so that the parts are so tight that you have to press them onto each other, but they can also then of course be released. For the cannon pinion, it's important that it's not too tight, because then you would not be able to set the time, or you would damage something when you tried. On the other hand, it cannot be too loose, because then the hands would not move. So pretty ingenious. And that also leads to how these different parts are secured to each other. It is mostly by two means, either by screws or by friction. You should not ever find anything glued together in a mechanical watch. The only exception being crystals that sometimes are glued, especially mineral crystals. All right, the keyless works, seems to be functioning. That means we can put in the pallet fork and lubricate it. For this old movement with low beat rate, we can use an oil. You can also use a grease if you prefer, but it's not really necessary with a grease for these old slower movements. And for those who are thinking that, my God, this guy's shaking like crazy, what's he rummaging all around there for? Well, it's pretty small, these things. And I'm trying not to shake the camera, so I cannot really touch the movement. So, all for you people. Let's get the balance in and see if we can make this baby run. With the balance running, we can then oil the rest of the train. Oiling or lubricating is one of the most important things when you service a watch. We use different oils for the different kinds of pivots. In general, the slower and more torque a wheel has, the thicker the pivot will be, and the thicker the oil will be as well. And the lighter, faster wheels towards the balance will have a thinner oil. So the watch actually runs pretty well from the outset. Just gonna adjust the rate a little bit. There are 4 values on the top of the screen there, and the most important is of course the rate. The amplitude is how far the balance swings in each direction. Should be in the high 200s in modern watches. The beat error is how off the ticks and the tocks are, basically. If it's tick-tock, tick-tock, or tick-tock, tick-tock. 1.2 is acceptable for this old watch. So we're going to be happy with that. Let's then commence with the rest of the chronograph works. First thing we put in is the driving wheel. Actually, with this watch, it would be smarter to put the driving wheel in a little bit later. But it's sort of a habit, so that's why I did it. And the reason it would be smarter to put it in later is because of this screw that holds the clutch lever down. We'll see that a little bit later. What is important when you're assembling a chronograph watch is to think a little bit about the sequencing. Some parts need to be under other parts, especially in chronographs, or on top of other parts if you will, but the under is actually the most important thing. Here we're putting in the clutch lever, and here we're putting in this infamous screw. The problem with this screw is that if you unscrew it, you're going to press upwards on the driving wheel. And that's probably how you got the little wobble in the wheel. Wobble is, however, not really impacting anything, so that's all right. Now for chronographs, there are a few different things that need to happen in a specific sequence when you press the different pushers. One of those things is that when the chronograph is not engaged, the chronograph counter hands should obviously not move. And they would move a little bit if they weren't actually held by something. And that something is then, of course, the hammer that we see working here. But the same thing is true when the chronograph is paused. So when the chronograph has been running for a little while and you stop it, for whatever reason, probably to show your watch off to a friend, since no one really uses the chronograph, but anyway, you want the hands to then stand still and to start again at the exact same point you stopped it in the first place. And this is then typically achieved with something we call the brake. The brake operates on the center wheel, the chronograph wheel, and basically just a small friction piece that holds it in place. But you might see that this movement doesn't have anything like that. And neither does its siblings. And the reason for this is that it's a very simplistic movement, very simply made. As noted in the other videos, they made millions of this family of movements. But the function still has to be there. So what you will see is that the braking function is actually part of the hammer. So when we pause the chronograph, the hammer will slightly touch the chronograph wheel. So we'll get back to that when we test the different functions of the chronograph. Let's just first check that the chronograph runs as it should and that the minute flips over on time. That looks all right. Let's run it a little bit faster and see once more. There's a little finger on the underside of the chronograph wheel, as you can see there, starting to engage with the intermediate minute wheel and flipping it over. Alright, with that we also need to lubricate the hammer. We're going to use some grease on the hammer ends. And there, you can see the hammer end touching the chronograph wheel ever so slightly. Alright, with that we're pretty much ready with the movement. So we can put the dial back on. First the hour wheel and this dial washer. We're not going to do anything with the dial. I'm going to leave it as it is. Let me know in the comments if you think this dial should be refinished. We talked a little bit about the refinishing dials in the Omega Genève video I did recently. But refinishing dials is a bit of a controversial topic among watch enthusiasts. Let's talk a little bit about that while I'm relooming the hands. And the reason I'm relooming them is because the loom started cracking. So we're going to do that. But for the refinishing of dials, it's important to understand what we actually mean by refinishing a dial. A dial is mostly made out of brass, even though it can be other materials. If you want to have an underlying pattern, like sunburst or brushed or that kind of thing, you would need to do that in the brass, so in the base metal of the dial. Then on top of that, you put coloring layers, you put silver layer, that kind of thing. Then you would print with a so-called pad printer, which is kind of a silicone balloon that you press onto the dial and do that repeatedly to achieve different printing effects, that kind of thing. And on top of that again, you would apply a few layers of varnish. And the varnish is typically a kind of a clear lacquer that is put in to protect the underlying details. The varnish is not a thick layer, so if you scratch the dial, for instance, then you're going to scratch the actual metal. But most of the time the varnish is what is actually changing in a watch. The varnish is what ages, what goes through different chemical processes due to sunlight, due to oxidation and so forth. So ideally you would just want to replace the varnish, right? Just remove the old varnish and put new varnish on, and Bob's your uncle. Well, the problem is that the varnish, of course, sticks to the dial. It sticks to the lettering, to the graphics on the dial. So when you remove the varnish, you will pretty much always also remove the printing. And obviously that will be an issue with most dials, because most dials have some sort of printing on them. And that's where the problem arises. If you have then removed the varnish, and with it the printing, you have to reprint the dial. And of course, if you want to have it the exact way it was when it came from the factory, you would have to have the same printing plate, which is basically a little mold that you put ink on, and then a silicone balloon presses down on it and presses that onto the dial metal. And as you can imagine, for old watches and brands that don't exist anymore, those printing plates are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find. Anyway, let's turn to the case. The case is in pretty bad shape. We're first going to take out the pushers, which are also friction fit in this case, and the crown tube, and then we're going to clean the case. And yes, the liquid I put it in isn't entirely clean in itself. That's alright, it's the first of many cleanings. With the case cleaned, we clamped it up in the lathe. And then we're gonna remove this really broken up old chrome. Now normally on watch cases you wouldn't use files, they're simply too rough. Even though these files are very fine. But we do need to use files to get off this rough top layer. The lathe is good for doing this on things that are circular, like the bezel. Well, it's not really the bezel, but the watch face, if you will, where the bezel would be. So we're using a few different grits to try to first get the cracked up old chrome off, and then to polish it. When we've done that, then we can turn to the rest of the case. There's not really any other good ways that I know of, at least, to take off this old metal. So again, we start with files, fine files of course, and then we work our way through different grits, starting from about 800 up to 7000 even for the polished parts. And then we're doing the same for the case sides. We're ultimately going to brush the case sides. I believe that was the original finish. But first we're gonna polish the rest. And also in this process it's pretty important to try to think a little bit about the sequencing. Otherwise you will often find yourself in a position where you're trying to work on one part and that impacts another part. And after an hour or two of work, this is where we end up. We put a brushed finish on the case sides. And the bezel, if you will, is polished, as well as the top of the lugs. So I think that looks a little bit better. We could actually leave the case like this. I think it looks pretty good, but there is this yellow sheen to it. So we're gonna plate it as well in palladium. So my son asked me a couple times if there are things I'm afraid of in life. And the biggest thing I'm afraid of is, of course, anything happening to the kids. But apart from that, I'm afraid of anything electric, including eels, which aren't really that common in my geographies anyway, but still. And that's why I got myself this very simple to use tabletop plating kit. It's called the Jewel Master, and we're plating this case with palladium, which looks quite similar to stainless steel. So what we did was to first clean the case in this left jar, and then we did the surface activation in the middle, and then we have palladium in this purple liquid. So leave it there for a minute, a little bit more than a minute. We'll actually do that twice to get a little bit thicker layer, and then the case should look much better. All right, then we can put the hands back on the dial, and we can case the movement. Given that there's no date on this watch, we don't have to worry about where we place the hour hand initially. We just of course need to make sure that the hour hand and the minute hand line up eventually. As you might have seen, I put some strong coffee on top of the new loom so that the hands look a little bit aged, trying to make them fit the dial. If the dial was refinished, it would of course look brand new, so then you wouldn't have to do anything like that with the loom either. And yes, I'm putting the minute hand slightly off midnight or 12 here. And that's because the hour hand has moved a little bit. So ultimately they should align. The hands are blued. And you can also re-blue the hands if you will. But again, given that the dial, we're keeping it the way it is, I'm not gonna make the hands look brand new. But I did blue hands in the video about Pavel Bure pocket watch. So you can refer to that video if you want to see how to do that. Then for the crystal, we're simply gonna replace it. That is what we commonly do with old crystals, replace them. Sometimes we have to polish them if they are of a special either size or shape or brand perhaps even. But generally they are consumables. So we're going to press fit a new crystal into the case. And there we are. For the crown then, it is extremely worn, so we're gonna take it off. The crown is screwed onto the stem, and that means we can also unscrew it. It is typically fastened, not with actual glue, but with a bonding agent, Loctite, typically. So we're also going to do that for the new crown, but let's first find the new crown. Obviously, we're not going to put on gold-plated crowns, so let's look at either the steel or chrome-plated ones. Now, there is a bit of an issue, and that issue is that the stem is extremely wide. Normally stems are 1 millimeter thick, give or take 0.1 typically, but this one is 1.4. And what you can often do is use a stem extender, but they don't typically come in that size. So I have to go with the crown you see here. It's slightly big, I think, but it's actually not that far from the pictures I saw on the Wikipedia page for this specific reference. But as you can see, there's a little bit too much of a gap between the stem and the case there, so we're going to shorten the stem a little bit. Using this diamond slip for that. And if you're a fan of fingernails scraping against the blackboard, then this is the stuff for you. With the stem at the right length, we put a little bit of Loctite at the end of the stem, and then we screw the crown on tight. And then it will stay there until we really need to get it off. The last thing we need to do then is to properly secure the movement in the case. Remember, it was loose in the case before. So I simply put in a couple of fitting screws and a couple of case clamps, and that holds the movement nicely in the case. Not going to show that since this video is already getting very long. So let's get the case back on. And then we can test the chronograph one last time just to make sure it runs as it should. And after letting it run for a few minutes, we can stop it. And that looks all right. All right, let's put a nice wrap on the watch and then get it ready to wear. The dial is certainly not new. It has some relatively significant wear, but I think it's still better to leave it the way it is than refinishing it. But let me know in the comments if you don't agree. I think it looks pretty good on the wrist. The blued hands do look quite nice in real life, even though they are worn as well and I didn't do anything about them. Still a pretty handsome watch in my opinion. I hope you liked this video. If you did, then clicking like, subscribe and commenting will really help the channel. We'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.